As you heard, the magic words have been spoken, so we're in great shape. People are still coming into the room, so I'm going to give everybody about 2 more minutes. So if this is your first time attending one of Stratford Hall's Zoom events, Zoom programs, we do not use the chat function. I find it distracting for the speakers. We have a Q&A at the bottom. I will give my talk, and then at the end, I will open up for questions, and we'll sort of go one by one. So, and I think raising the hand is, someone just raised their hand and I can't find where that person went. But if you have any question, just type it into the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. And I will be going through those at the end of the lecture. So I'll give everybody about 1.5 minutes more. Seeing a lot of familiar names. This is so exciting. I have been very ready to give this talk ever since the discoveries have been made. So I'm ready for this, for sure. All right, a few more minutes here and we'll kick this off. It is raining here where I am, and so if there's some strange pause in me speaking, just, send me in the chat, just say, you're paused or your internet froze, and I'll try to catch that and stop talking until it comes back. Sometimes when the wind blows, as we all know in this Zoom era, the connection's a little bit funky, so we'll make sure it doesn't happen tonight, but we should be good. I'm going to give about 60 more seconds to let everyone join in here for tonight's program. I have to say, this is one of my favorite topics to talk about, material culture, spirituality, African American history, and the fact that it's really turning up right now at Stratford is quite exciting, professionally and personally for myself, to be able to be a part of all this that's happening. So I'm just going to wait till my clock says 7:03, and then I'm going to kick it off. Welcome everyone who's jumping in the room right now. I wish this was in person, but it's not. All right, I'm going to go ahead and kick it off. It is 7:03. Welcome everyone to Stratford Hall's program. Tonight, I'll be Dr. Kelley Fanto Deetz. I'm the Director of Programming, Education, and Visitor Engagement at Stratford Hall. I'm an archaeologist. I'm a historian of the African diaspora. My specialty is the history and culture of enslaved Africans in Virginia, mostly, but also throughout the diaspora. I have a PhD from UC Berkeley in African diaspora studies. And through my multiple years of formal education and research and work after I graduated, teaching courses at the college level, etc., I have learned a fair amount about the process of reevaluating collections, of looking for new stories at old sites to bring out the stories of those who have not been talked about before. So tonight, I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen here. So give me 1 second. I've got some pretty great slides. All right. Make this full screen. Hold on here. This is always the awkward part of the presentation, so give me a second. I'll move my face out of here. All right, so tonight's talk is entitled, we have a question. Hold on a second here. All right, ready to go. All right, that piece of material culture there on the right side is one of the highlights of tonight's talk. All right, so tonight's talk is entitled Hidden in the Walls, Secrets of the Enslaved Community at Stratford Hall. So I do what I do in terms of not just at Stratford Hall, but professionally. As a scholar of the African American past, I do this work because it's rewarding. It's rewarding because, one, it's exciting. I'm a passionate scholar, a lover of history, and a lover of research, but I'm also a storyteller. And I feel like the combination of those things with my passion for African American history has really brought me into this field with great drive and great excitement. And I think if you've heard any of my talks, I tend to get a little enthusiastic when it comes to telling these stories. But I think in particular, this particular talk tonight is very exciting because it's new things at Stratford Hall that my team and I did not know were there. And we're bringing fresh eyes to old objects, to old stories, to really bring forward, shine light onto the hidden histories of all of those who were enslaved at Stratford Hall. Would help if my slide Went forward. Okay, right on. So we're going to start at Stratford Hall. For those of you that do not know what Stratford Hall is, this is my my workplace right here. It's an honor to do the history, the archaeology, the interpretation, all the things that I'm sort of in charge of here at Stratford Hall is something that I value every day, and I absolutely am honored to do. Stratford Hall was established in 1738 by a Mr. Thomas Lee and his wife Hannah Ludwell Lee, and they had the house built in 1738, this big Georgian mansion and all the outbuildings. And if you see here, if you haven't been to Stratford, it's quite stunning. This is considered one of the most important architectural homes in the United States of America. It's also home to was home to 4 generations of the Lees. And it was also home to a significant number of enslaved African and African Americans. In 1738, a boat coming up the Potomac brought with, the boat was brought, 70 enslaved Africans that were purchased in Senegambia, present day Ghana, then was the Gold Coast, and St. Helena Island before making the middle passage across the Atlantic. Those 70 enslaved Africans began the construction of what we see here in front of us. The main building, the mansion, every brick that you see here was carved out of the clay from around Stratford, molded, fired by enslaved hands, as well as constructed. And they were working alongside indentured servants who were white from Europe. And the labor force was mostly African during this period and predominantly African throughout the tenure of the Lees and afterwards. And during this moment in 1738 is really this sort of beginning of the African presence at Stratford Hall. So, well, how did I end up working at Stratford Hall? Let's just start there. So I'm an interdisciplinary scholar. I was brought on to give a couple of talks about, I have a book about enslaved cooks and food in Virginia. So I was initially brought out to talk about my forthcoming book called Bound to the Fire. It's been out now for years. I was then a speaker at one of the Lee Circle events, and I quickly fell in love with the site. I fell in love with the history there, with the potential to tell stories of all people. The history of the Lees is also very fascinating. And I really was pulled into sort of wanting to know more about the enslaved community. One of the first things that anyone does that does the kind of work that I do is they see what's written down, right? So we look for things like these 1782 inventories that literally list the name of the enslaved person, their age, and how much money that they were worth. This by itself is a very important piece of information. It tells you sort of basic information, but you have to go beyond this. As a scholar of African American history, especially the earlier periods, you have to do what's called reading against the archive. So you can sort of be, you can give up and say, look, we don't know anything. All we have are names and ages and, maybe some occupations. You see here a man named Congo. He was a bricklayer, and I'll be talking about him in a little bit, and others as well. But by reading against the archive, by really reading against the grain of these things, you can start to really tell stories about some of these people. Thinking about the ratio of men to women, how many children were on site. One of the most striking things that I found in my recent research is that in the 1740s, the majority of the people who were enslaved on site were children under the age of 15. And that was very striking to me. So those kinds of bits of information are really important, but they don't tell the whole story. You have to look at other things. You have to look at the archaeology. You have to look at the material culture that was left behind from these people who could not write their own history. You have to look at the cultural landscape, the architectural design of the house. What does that say about how they had to move through space, how there were black spaces, white spaces, mixed spaces. All of these things are very important in helping to really have a sort of more colorful, sort of broader and more deep idea of what life was like on this plantation, or anyone for that matter. Of course, foodways, looking at what people ate, is also a way to sort of fill in that sort of information. So, oops, sorry. Go back. Give me 1 second here. All right. So, We are here tonight, not to necessarily talk about the probate records or to talk about sort of my ways in which that my team and I sort of navigate the archives, but we're here to talk about some of the recent discoveries that came about literally when we were curating our exhibit that's called Stratford at the Crossroads, Atlantic Cultures and the Creation of America. This exhibit was born out of really a want and enthusiasm of telling the story of everyone at Stratford. It was also born out of a love of artifacts. We have an incredible collection of objects that belong to the Lee family, that also belong to the enslaved African and African Americans. We've got portraits, we've got architectural remnants. I mean, Stratford Hall has a wealth of objects that can tell stories. And so Stratford Hall at the Crossroads is all about the sort of collision of the cultures of the Atlantic that happened at Stratford Hall. So really taking the stories and the objects of those who were brought over enslaved from the west and central coast of Africa, the people that were there living, the natives that were there living, the Virginia Indians, when Stratford was established, and then of course the Lee family as well. What did that look like? What did their material culture look like? And what do those objects, those personal belongings, those paintings, the architectural remnants that are sort of have been removed from the house during preservation efforts. What do those things say individually about the people that they belong to and the people that made them? But also, what do they say collectively about Stratford Hall and the history there? What do they say collectively about Virginia and the history of the United States of America? And I think that looking at all of these things collectively, literally as a crossroads, and if you think about the ways in which even the phrase crossroads is used, it's this sort of collision of present and future. It is the collision of all different sort of cultures coming together in this particular space. And so I felt like it was really important to have this idea of crossroads, because there are individual lines that then create something that we have the history of here at Stratford. The left side of the gallery is a portrait gallery, and it's all about the ladies in the 18th century, both and 19th century, both the Lee ladies as well as the enslaved. And then we have in the middle of the exhibit, we have cases filled of all of the objects that we chose. Amy Connolly is the curator of this exhibit, and her together with the research team, Judy Hinson, Kelly Childress, all the others, we've really put together this really stunning exhibit of objects that tell the story of all the different people that once lived at Stratford. And on the right side of the exhibit is what we have as the preservation gallery. So it's objects related to the historic preservation efforts at Stratford Hall. And up until about 2 months ago, or maybe 6 weeks ago, that wall, that part of the exhibit was pretty straightforward. You know, it was doors that were removed during renovations. It was windowsills, those kinds of things, you know, that really tell the story of the architecture of the house. So Amy was thinking like, okay, well, maybe we should have some objects that are on that side of the wall that have been found in the walls. And so she literally went down into collections and she found a box of things that have been pulled out of the walls during the decades of renovation efforts at Stratford Hall. And that is when she pulled this object out. All right, if you, computer, are going to be fussy. Okay, here we go. All right, so in this box of objects found in the walls, she pulled out this envelope. And it said on there, and I'm not sure exactly when this was found. I think it was before Judy Hinson's tenure. I'm thinking it was sometime, you know, maybe mid 20th century, this was found. And it was labeled there as flint found behind the northeast window seat in the Great Hall. And she thought it was a little strange. She's like, I don't know if this is flint or not, but there's an X on it. And I find this really interesting. And I immediately saw, one, it wasn't flint, it was a crystal. Flint is not crystal. And secondly, the markings on there are on both sides. There were an intentional X or a cross on the front and the back of this crystal. And my training in African American and African diaspora religious practices pretty much directed me to exactly what it was. And I was very excited about that. So we're gonna put a pause on this right now, and we're gonna back up and start from the beginning. So we're gonna work through this. So just so you know, we're the northeast window seat. This is where it was recovered. So back in the mid 20th century, this windowsill right here was taken off. They were fixing the windowsill. And in order to take this off, you have to, oops, sorry. Wow. You have to move the entire seat that's right there. So it's not something that you can literally just kind of pull back and slip something in there. You have to take the entire wall apart to get down where they found that crystal. So that was pretty interesting. And again, I'll tell you in a little bit why the location of this is significant. But what I want to do is pause all of this and think about who was building the house. I had mentioned in the very beginning of my talk that a lot of the enslaved laborers were tasked with building the house. And we're going to talk about some of them in particular right now. So there was a man named Congo who was the bricklayer. He was also the plasterer. And I'll go back to that last slide. He would have been somebody who was in charge of, doing the plaster work in the Great Hall. He also was hired out to do a lot of the plaster work in the county and became a very well-known, skilled, enslaved carpenter or plasterer or bricklayer, if you were. And his name was Congo, just like the Congo Kingdom. And he was there as a small child and spent the majority of his life at Stratford Hall. And I would argue that he probably was one of the people who were building this great hall and the house itself. There were others, like a man named Harry, who was the fiddler, who was also a carpenter, and a long list of other enslaved African men who were doing the carpentry in and around the house. It's very likely that Congo probably came from the Congo Kingdom. I don't want to get too deep in the weeds in terms of talking about naming practices, but a lot of times people would be renamed as they were enslaved, either on the ship or by their plantation owner. And sometimes they would use words that, that either the person said themselves or that where they came from. And so Congo was absolutely well known as early as the 1480s, 1483 exactly, the Portuguese made contact with then the King of Congo, and the sort of relationship between Portugal, which was a Catholic country, became tethered with that of the Congo Kingdom. Within a few years, the King of Congo, whose name was King Nzinga Nkun, he decided that he was going to convert to Catholicism and make the Congo Kingdom a Catholic kingdom. That's another lecture that I can give some other time, but this is the first sort of very formal interaction, partnership, if you will, between Europeans and an African kingdom. This quickly turned sour, where illegal trading started happening and the slave trade kicked in. Other European colonists started coming down, West Africa, Spain, then later by, France, England, etc., making different relationships with different kingdoms, and it really became a very sort of large sort of effort into colonizing the, quote, New World and bringing enslaved Africans with them. So where do these enslaved Africans come from? I like maps and I like charts, so I'm going to do a little bit of this before I get back to those pictures. But if you look here, and I said at the very beginning of my talk, a significant number of the enslaved at Stratford, those first 70 people that showed up, were from the Senegambia region. You see that right here. You have Sierra Leone. The Bight of Benin is a huge area here, very significant in the slave trade as well. And then you've got, of course, the Congo region down here, etc. And if you notice as well, West and Central Africa had the largest amount of people being shipped out because that was the first place that trade started and the last place it ended. So Brazil, for instance, and the Portuguese there, they were in the slave trade first and they were the last to leave the slave trade. If you see these numbers right here, the significant number of enslaved Africans, of the 12.5 million documented enslaved Africans that were captured and sold into slavery, were brought to South America, Brazil primarily. The second most sort of largest group was brought to the Caribbean, and then only 4% of those 12.5 million were brought to what was the British North America, and that excludes the Caribbean colonies of the Brits. And before I even get into that too, understanding too that the Spanish and the French and the Portuguese were all Catholic. And so that was very much a part of their colonization as well, was to spread the church where, colonists such as the British were not necessarily pushing their religion as much as the others. So blacksmithing and carpentry were skills that these enslaved folks brought over with them. Things like blacksmithing had been around and have been around for centuries in West and Central Africa. And these people that were brought over, someone like Congo, very well might have already known how to be a blacksmith, already known how to do a lot of the sort of carpentry that was needed at somewhere like Stratford Hall. They were not blank slates that were trained in the quote New World. They had very diverse skill sets and brought over a wealth of knowledge and skills that literally helped build the United States of America. Of these 12.5 million West and Central African people, they all practiced a diverse sort of variety of religions. So you had, of course, a small number of them who had converted to Catholicism. In the Congo, that's another very sort of complicated lecture I could give at some point. Also, Islam had been very much sort of dominant colonization force up in the northwest parts of Africa. And you also have then sort of the rest of West and Central Africa, who was really made up of people practicing traditional African religions, ancient religions that had, you know, very strong sort of connective tissue, if you will, with one another. So this right here is an image of a man in West Africa, and he is known as a healer. And if you see here, he's got a belt with things sort of strapped to it, and he is using the shell of a turtle to do some sort of religious practice of sorts. And there's, of course, a lion that's very pretty looking over there looking at this sort of practice. But this really is very symbolic of the ways in which a lot of these West African spiritual practices were very much rooted in using shells and using the natural world and using water to be able to practice their religion. So many of these enslaved African folks that were brought over into the colonies, they had very different religious backgrounds, but there were certain things that overlapped. And those are the things that became very much like certain belief systems and practices that became very much a part of what happened in the diaspora, what happened in the colonies amongst these enslaved communities. These people that practiced, you know, this religious work, root work, if you will, you know, they were literally working in the colonies as doctors, as midwives, and there's tons of records of white folks, right, plantation folks going down to the slave quarter to get treatment for different ailments. And so their value as healers was something that was acknowledged and valued very much by the people who enslaved them. These people that were also enslaved, they were ethnically and religiously and linguistically diverse. So it's important to think of one of the most, you know, Africa as the continent is one of the most diverse continents in the world, if not the most diverse. At the period of the transatlantic slave trade, there were, you know, 3,000 plus distinct ethnic groups that were being traded into the transatlantic slave trade. There were wars going on, and prisoners of war were captured and sold, you know, as a way to make money and for these different kingdoms to then sort of elevate themselves in their own kingdoms in West and Central Africa. So if you, I love this picture right here. This is from the 1830s in Brazil, and what I love about this picture is it's you know, a series of absolutely stunning women, and you see all the adornment and you see the very distinct sort of stylistic ways in which these women, even though they were enslaved, were able to sort of have dignity, right, in the world of the enslaved in Brazil in particular. So they were diverse, of course, ethnically, linguistically, and absolutely religiously. So these people were, you know, diverse in the sense that they were from different kingdoms. They were Fulani, they were Igbo, they were Yoruba, they were Congo. They spoke different languages. A lot of the enslaved folks that were brought over were already bilingual, and by the time they got into the colonies, they had to then learn a third language, the language of whatever colony they were traded to then be able to survive. So it was in that space and in the space of this African diaspora that these forced prisoners of war, these captives that were sold off from West Africa into the colonies, sometimes were on a ship with people that didn't speak their language. So if you can imagine being sold into slavery, being forced onto a ship, not speaking the language of anybody else around you, there's certain things that developed out of that sort of forced integration of these different ethnic groups. A lot of that you see in different forms of Creole and the different pidgin languages that you see throughout the African diaspora. And you also see this kind of mixing in the religious world as well. So once the enslaved African folks ended up in the colonies, they used the religion because they needed to. The same way that religion functions for anyone who practices, you use it when you're afraid. You use it when you need hope. You use it to empower yourself, to empower your community. And it was through the sort of mixing of these different ethnic groups that certain particular kinds of religious practices formed in the colonies. And so things that were sort of common between different groups sort of elevated themselves. A lot of the folks that, sort of felt, a lot of the folks that were practicing these religions in the colonies, they universally believed in ancestors being very much alive and important for their different religious practices. They believed in engaging the natural world in different ways to conjure their ancestors for protection, etc. They would use music and drumming to protect themselves by conjuring their different spirits, to conjuring their ancestors, to sort of call for war at times, etc. And, expressing themselves through everything through dance, like the ring shout, etc. All of these different things were born out of these very diverse West African cultures coming together, realizing that they had to make this new sort of cultural practice, all rooted in West African religious practices. So you see this sort of manifestation of West African religious sort of belief systems in different colonies in different ways. If you look at the Catholic colonies, for instance, and I'm Catholic, so I feel very comfortable sort of talking about this. Catholics, did and still do, a lot of us do, believe in the ancestral world, believe that, believe in saints, right? Santeria, for instance, was born out of Yoruba deity worship, very traditional sort of West African gods, deities, and goddesses. And they were prayed to and conjured upon, etc. in West Africa. When those certain people, the Yoruba people, came to a Spanish colony, such as Cuba and Puerto Rico and other places, they were forced to convert to Catholicism, which had a very sort of, bold and iconic iconography with things like, saints, etc. And what they did is they used those Catholic saints and literally masked their traditional West African deities with them. And so they could pretend like they were worshiping Santa Barbara, but really they're worshiping Shango or one of their deities. So it's a fascinating way that religious sort of practices of West Africa sort of manifested in a Catholic state. You also see that happening in Vodou and French colonies, especially Haiti. And what you see here on this side is you see what are called veves. And these are literal marks that were put down. They're used in chalk or other eggshell or any sort of powdery substance. They would be put down on the ground or in other sort of surfaces to conjure spirits into the space. And, I have to say that Vodou is one of the most misunderstood religions in the world. And I think that people need to know more about it. Again, I could give another talk or have someone come and give a talk on that at some point, but it's not as relevant to tonight's talk, so I will not focus on it. But it's important to understand that these different religious practices hid behind some very sort of traditional Catholic ones in these different colonies. So what you see in British North America, which I said, remember, had 4% of the 12.5 million, you see a little bit more of a subtle sort of practicing of these West African religious beliefs. Excuse me. So, of course, the British were Protestant. They brought their Anglican church over. They did not have statues of saints everywhere to sort of hide behind and pretend to worship. And so what manifested universally in places like Virginia, for instance, or anywhere in the British colonies of North America, is you had the Congo cosmogram, which is right here. So if anybody's ever, heard of Robert Johnson or heard the word crossroads, the blues legend Robert Johnson was said to have sold his soul to the devil at the crossroads, back in the early 20th century. And it's this kind of sort of image right here that you see that you find carved into different things. And we're going to be talking about this here. So the Congo cosmogram is a universal way that enslaved Africans would sort of put marks on things to represent the lines between the living and the dead, and the lines, and they're not dead because they're spirits. So the spirits and the sort of living versus birth and life. So you see a counterclockwise movement here. And this means that, sort of your life cycle goes in a counterclockwise way. And you are either on the ancestral side or you're on the sort of living side. And then you see that there's water in the inside, and I'll be talking about that in a moment. And there's a line sort of between it. So it's the idea that literally the ancestors, the spirits of those who have passed on, who have transitioned, are walking among you. They're here, and you can bring them into the space by using the sort of symbol of the crossroads. And this right here on the right side is the cache, which I'll be talking about in a moment. So these symbols were drawn on a lot of artifacts during the period of enslavement. You see them found in archaeological records in the bottoms of pots in South Carolina. You see them carved into spoons. You see them carved into walls. And there's actually been a significant number of these X's found recently in some objects up in New Jersey. I just spoke to a guy up there about the X's that he's been finding in his house, the houses that he runs in the 18th century. And you typically see this in archaeological records or, carved into architectural sort of pieces, right? And it's a very sort of exciting thing when you run across this. And they were carved into these sort of objects to conjure the spirit, right? So we're going to talk about that here in a second. This right here is a crystal that was found at Montpelier by our colleagues over there, James Madison's Montpelier. And this was also found, there's no X mark on this, but this was also found in the north corner, but it was in the slave quarter. It was not in the main house. So it's, I think, very exciting. Now we can come back to the sort of object of the hour, and I have another sort of object bit that we'll be talking about in a moment. But you can see with what I just told you, this is not a piece of flint that was just randomly sort of dropped into the wall. So this is very exciting. These crystals were typically placed in the north corner, northeast, or northwest of buildings. You see evidence of this throughout the mid-Atlantic and throughout the South. And these would have been placed into these spaces to protect whomever was there. So my theory, and I'm still working on this, but my theory is that very possibly maybe Congo or somebody else carved this X into here, conjured spirits to help, or their ancestors to help protect them in the site, and hid it in the wall. A lot of these things as well, not only are they placed in the north or the east, but they're also sometimes placed in thresholds, so below or above doorways or windows, because it was also believed that bad spirits, witches, etc. This is also true for white folks, and I'll have to give another lecture on some of the witch marks that we're finding that were probably placed by the Lee family, which are fascinating and really sort of get into the belief systems of the 18th century. But this would have been placed in there for protection. And so this object really tells a story of, the intention of this piece, a sort of secret object that was placed in the wall by one of the enslaved people. And also calcite crystal, which this is not local to Stratford. So this person, whoever it was that carved this and put it into the wall, must have traded it from somewhere. So it's a fascinating little bit of history there. I'm going to pivot to the second sort of secret that we found in the walls. So during this sort of curatorial project, my research team, we're getting super excited. I flipped out the fact that we had this crystal. I was calling everybody I knew, talking about it like, oh my God, guess what we have? And so we're all excited. And our wonderful archivist and director of research, Judy Hinson, got really excited about this stuff as well. And so she started looking up, African spiritual stuff and conjuring, etc. And she ran across an article that talked about how rats' nests were sometimes sort of mislabeled, and they were actually caches. There were actually spiritual bundles of things that were left intentionally by enslaved people in the walls of houses. So if you see here on the left, you see this exhibit it was still up. And it's funny, I walked past this the last few years, didn't pay it any attention. I was like, oh, a rat. Okay, whatever. I didn't even look to see what it was, and that's definitely my fault. But if you see here, it talks about how it was a rat's nest. Now, this plate right here was found, amongst other things, which I'll show you in a moment, with some broken pieces of blue and white pottery and a stick with a nail in it. I don't know any rat besides some sort of mutant, teenage mutant ninja mouse or rat that could probably take this all the way up the steps. So this rat's nest was found in the attic above the Great Hall, which the other crystal was also found in. This photograph here was taken by our curator, Amy Connolly, who has a wonderful way of making things look very dramatic. This is the aesthetic of our exhibit as well. And I want to go over what these things are. So I was incredibly honored to be able to, one, realize this was in our collections and to reevaluate something that had been mislabeled, but to speak to a hoodoo practitioner. She's Queen Co, and I have an acknowledgement with her full name in the end, but I was able to talk with her and go over every single one of these objects to confirm what I thought they were, to confirm what scholars have been writing about for years, with someone who actually is a multi-generational hoodoo practitioner. So this rat's nest, quote, was assembled and intentionally put above the Great Hall by an enslaved person. We're not sure who, but I do want to go over each one of these objects and what they mean and why they were probably put in there. So we'll go ahead and start with the pottery. This right here is a porcelain plate, and it has crabs on it, which you see. This dates the 1740s. This was one of the sort of most expensive sets of china that the Lees had during the 1740s, and it obviously broke at some point and was reused. And you also see other bits of ceramic here and glass that were broken, were broken and painted. So piece by piece, anything that is blue or white, and you see that the pottery here, the ceramics here are blue and white. Anything that is blue and white or sharp is very significant. So the blue and white is symbolic of the ancestral land. So that Congo cosmogram that I showed you all earlier, the common belief amongst many African descendant people is that when you die in the living world, your soul, your spirit passes through the water to get to the ancestral land. If anyone has seen Black Panther, they actually did a wonderful job sort of illustrating that concept. The ancestral land is white, and I don't mean white skin, but think about skeletons. It's very literal. It's a sort of bright white space. And so anything blue and white signifies that passing through water, the ancestral land. It's really giving an honor to those who have passed. The sharpness of this and the glass and the nails, which I'll talk about in a moment, was literally there to poke and protect. So to poke evil spirits from coming into that space. Again, I think, spirituality, the ideas of spirits being real was commonly believed among both the enslaved folks and the Lees as well. And so the idea was that any spirit that was going to come into the space would have been poked by any of those pointy things that you see here. We also have shells, which are symbolic of water and passing through. So, this plate right here is white, but it also has something from the sea in it, which was very symbolic of that passage into the ancestral world. And then the nails, of course, would act, as I said, as a weapon against evil spirits. And then there are these shells, which are obvious from what I just said, and some bones as well. Now, there's things in here that are personal objects, and I think what my favorite thing that's in this cache of objects is some fabric here that you see. There's several pieces of fabric that came from enslaved people's clothes. They're all blue and white. They're checkered patterned. I would love to sort of raise some money or figure out a way to get some DNA and sort of chemistry sort of testing done on these things to see what else might have been in that bundle when it was put into this cache. But what I was told by Queen Co is that these personal objects, this button down here, the personal sort of pieces of fabric would have either been used in one of two ways. It would have been put into the cache to protect the person that thing belonged to. If the button belonged to somebody that was having a hard time and they needed protection from a spirit, from the ancestors, they would put that person's button in there. That person's bit of cloth would go in there if they needed protection, or it would have been put in there off of someone who had passed away, to conjure that person's spirit, that ancestor, to come protect those who were enslaved at the site. And then lastly, you have a stick back here that has a nail in it, and the other nails as well. Nails were very much a part of what was considered inkisis in the Congo, which were figurines of people that were literally seen to be encompassing a spirit, and you would offer them things, and you would pierce them to sort of make offerings and to sort of ignite them into the space. And so something like taking a piece of wood and putting a nail through it, you would sort of activate this cache to be powerful, to protect those who were on site. So I think it's important too, just to sort of talk about shells a little bit more broadly. Shells were used throughout the African diaspora among enslaved folks, and even before the transatlantic slave trade in places like the Congo and other parts, because they signify the ancestral land, the passing through water. They were typically placed on graves. And so I think shells are really important in understanding as well the burial practices of enslaved folks of African descent. And before we sort of pivot onto the exhibit and sort of wrapping this up, I want to share one last sort of wall art bit. It's a secret that was in the wall that was, again, right in front of us. This right here is a painting of a horse. And for me, it looks like something you would see in Greece or Syria. It's this stunningly drawn horse above the hearth in the southwest building at Stratford Hall. And I've worked at Stratford now for 3 years, and the sign that's there just said it's a horse. I'm like, okay, that's great. A horse was painted in this space, didn't say who painted it. Judy Hinson was able to find a record, an oral history, that talked about this horse and who painted it. Turns out that a woman named Rose Weldon, who was enslaved at Stratford Hall, who was the daughter of the cook, painted this sometime in the early 1800s. And I mean like teens and 20s or 30s. And she also painted a series of figurines above the hearth in the kitchen that have long since gone. So that's a way that the oral history has really helped us fill in, read against that archive, right? Really literally sort of push back against the sort of more traditional ways of doing history to encompass the oral history of the descendants of the enslaved, to encompass all of the things that we've been talking about in terms of archaeological records and sort of telling those stories. And it really, I think, sort of pushes me and should push anyone who's involved in this kind of work to really reevaluate your collections, to think about what you're looking at and to look at it with new and fresh eyes. So here are the two sort of gems of the exhibit in terms of the stories of the enslaved. Got the crystal in a box on the wall, and it's lit up very dramatically. We also have the cache and this very strange, but I kind of love it, case that's for model boats. Amy and I felt really strongly that we didn't want it to have it in a regular case, and so we spoke to some folks and figured out this was the right thing to do. So we put it in here with lots of sort of space to look at, and underneath this we have offering of water to the ancestors and a white candle. Of course, we're not going to light that on fire, but we are doing what we've been told to do by practitioners of hoodoo, by the descendants, to make sure we're honoring these objects the way that we need to do. So we have a lot of work to do at Stratford Hall. I'm not doing this work alone. I have the most amazing, phenomenal team, both on-site and off-site, that are helping me tell these stories and bring everyone's story to light. We are hosting our first Africans Day this summer on July 24th, where we're going to be commemorating those first 70 Africans and all of their descendants who labored at Stratford. And we are in contact with the descendants of a lot of those who were enslaved at Stratford Hall. If you're on this Zoom right now, please let me know if you're a descendant and would like to be part of this project. We are cleaning the cemetery up. This is the African American Cemetery, one of several that are on site. We know where 2 are, and we're still sort of wondering where the others are. And we've got this all laid out. This was an altar that was set up, and I'll show you what we were doing with it in a moment. But we made offerings to those who were buried there, the white roses, just making this space an honorable space where people can pay respect to the dead and really sort of contemplate and think about what they did to make Stratford what it was, what they have also done in the legacy of their history and labor in America. It was an honor to have an exceptional group of storytellers continue to come to Stratford Hall. Again, if you've attended any of my other programs, you know Dontavius Williams, who's pictured here, and Cheney McKnight as well. Groups of people that come to do work of African descendant people, whether they're descendant of those enslaved at Stratford or just doing the work in, sort of New York is where these folks came from, some of them. Anyone that comes to the site, it's important that we bring them to the cemetery and really show them the full story of Stratford Hall and let them pay honor as they wish to do. And this ceremony right here was a very sort of spontaneous one. I laid out all the stuff and then was able to sort of, walk back. So this was a very beautiful moment, peaceful moment, and it really sort of reflects the ways in which we can use this history to tell these stories and to ultimately heal. I cannot do this work without some of the people in this slide. You have Amy Connolly right here. She's my curator. In the middle is Dontavius Williams, who is not, as he knows, a descendant of the enslaved at Stratford, but he absolutely has his own history and he does wonderful interpretations and storytelling at Stratford. You have his kitchen pepper right there. And if you don't know what that is, he sells some pretty delicious kitchen pepper. Go to the Chronicles of Adam to check that out. And then we have Miss Denise Smith here, who's one of my staff members, and she is a descendant of the enslaved at Stratford. And it is through work like this, through working with different people, that we're telling these stories, that we're able to give honor to those who labored at Stratford and to really bring Stratford's history to light in ways that it hasn't in the past. The Lees would have absolutely, understood the contributions of the enslaved during their lifetime there. And I think it's important for us to do the same now after they are long gone. And of course, I have people like Kelly Childress, who's a manager of interpretation, and a wonderful sort of larger team that's really helping push these stories forward. So I'm going to end this talk by just saying a few things. These objects that we're finding, the stories that we're learning, the relationships that we're building at Stratford through this work have changed the fabric of the storytelling at Stratford. We are not getting rid of any of the stories that existed before. We are simply adding others to the already phenomenal and important stories of Stratford and of Virginia. It is through all of this work that I find meaning in my life, and it is an honor to do the work. It is an honor to tell the stories and to do the research to find the history that's been hidden in the walls, hidden in the ground, hidden in the archive for centuries, and bring those stories and those people's lives and legacies to light. Special thanks to Queen Co Meadows, the hoodoo queen of the imperial court, Milner Meadows de la Pont, and to all of those who left their marks to shed light onto this history. Thank you. All right, now it comes time for Q&A. So again, I feel like I'm sitting here talking to myself, so I apologize. All right. Dontavius says Deetz. Yes. Hello, Dontavius. All right. Yes. Trisha asks, hello, you said the enslaved from Senegambia regions. So were they actually from Senegal, Gambia, or actually Ghana, which is from a different region? So they were from Senegambia, which is Senegal and Gambia now, and also from Ghana. So there are three different regions now, but at the time then, Senegambia was seen as one, and Ghana was called the Gold Coast. So it was that sort of generic area. So thank you for asking that. Let's see here. Sorry, I'm trying to navigate this here. All right, Kim asks, were you able to find the probable source of the crystal? No, and the research has just begun. So it's one of those things, I could have waited a year. to tell everybody what we found in the walls, but I was so excited, absolutely so excited to share this news. And I think that a lot of the research that we do that's really challenging like this, both because of the lack of evidence and also just the politics of it all and the sort of the sensitivity of it, when you do talks like this, you end up learning things. And there might be somebody on here that knows something that, I need to know about all of this. So, for me, research is not just one person going into an archive. It's having conversations like this. So hopefully we will find out. I would like to get some geologists to look at that crystal. I would like to get it under a microscope, and who knows what we'll find out. So thank you for asking him. Let's see here. Thank you, Nicole. Said, just want to say thank you. This was fantastic. Can't wait to get back up there. Nicole Moore is one of the team of African-American storytellers that are sort of family to us at Stratford, and we can't wait to have you back. Thank you for saying hello and for attending. Barbara says, thank you for a wonderful enlightenment of slaves at Stratford Hall. Will you be continuing your investigation and work? Absolutely. I will be doing this forever and ever and ever, and I love this work more than anything, and that's why, my dad was an archaeologist and a historian, and he actually dug one of the first African-American sites up in Massachusetts in the 1960s, and he was the first person to engage with the descendant community to make sure the work was done with their consent. And having grown up in his house, decades after that work was done, it sort of got baked into me. In this work, he always said, find what you love and figure out a way to get paid doing it. And I love doing this work. It is the most rewarding, beautiful, challenging work that I could ever imagine doing. So thank you for asking that, Barbara. How do you identify the descendants? That's asked by Angela. Excellent, excellent question. So a lot of folks, like the ones that I know already, they are still in the area, right? They have direct lines to the Johnson, the Paynes. There's certain families that have never left the northern neck of Virginia. And I just met a group of descendants from a family that did leave about 70 years ago or so. And they attended one of my Zoom talks for another museum. And they attended because they saw that I was talking about Stratford, and they reached out and said, you know what, we have this oral history. We know we came from there. And as far as I'm concerned, oral history is gold when it comes to tracing the history of these descendants. And, I value that as much as anything written. So it's a combination of things. But, honestly, if anyone's done their family tree, and I did mine recently, once you get past your great-grandparents, those ancestors start to multiply so fast and so broad that I would, honestly think that anybody that has any ancestor within that area probably had somebody related that was at the plantation. So thank you for asking that. Kim says, fascinating. I hope you can find somebody to do the DNA test. I would absolutely love to do that. That would be exceptional. It might happen. All right, let me see here. All right, a question here from Yvonne. Was there any exchange of enslaved persons between plantations of the Lees? Yes. Corbins? Yes. Yes. Absolutely. Interconnectedness, or did the enslaved person tend to stay in one plantation? Curious about descendants of those families. Excellent question. So absolutely, enslaved people were traded between family members. They were given away as gifts. They were sent away for punishment, etc. And there's significant records actually at Stratford of these kinds of transactions. So I don't know about all the families that you mentioned, but I know for a fact that they absolutely traded enslaved people between one another, because you see it in the letters written back to the different families. So thank you for asking that. The majority of the people did end up staying on that plantation, but absolutely it was a thing. Becky says, absolutely fascinating. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Denise. Fantastic. Everyone's just saying thank you, which is really, really nice. Let me look for a question. This is good. No questions? Come on. Let me see.